Hey, well, welcome back to App Promotion Summit Berlin 2021. This is the penultimate session today, only two left. Yeah, really excited for this one. RevenueCat's one of the most interesting companies in the space. We're delighted to get them involved in App Promotion Summit Berlin. Jens was supposed to be presenting over in the in-person event last week, but couldn't make it. So we're really happy to have him here live and direct online. So please give him a big App Promotion Summit Berlin online edition. Welcome to the virtual stage. Over to you, Jens.
Thank you, James. Cool. So today I'm talking about, is the end of in-app purchases coming? And of course, James already introduced me. My name is Jens. I'm head of product at RevenueCat. Just a little bit more about myself before we get started. Again, head of product at RevenueCat. So for those of you who aren't familiar with RevenueCat, we do subscription management and infrastructure primarily for mobile-based subscription-based mobile apps. So, everything from kind of managing the backend, handling the purchases inside the app, providing access to the data via APIs, integrations, exports, and then analytics on top of that. Previously, I was at 8Fit, so a subscription-based fitness and nutrition app, and there I was initially focused on product growth and monetization, and later head of product. Then all my kind of social details, social contacts are on here, so feel free to get in touch if you want to. And one disclaimer before we get started: there are a bunch of somewhat legal topics in this presentation, and I'm not a lawyer, and of course this should not be seen as any kind of legal advice. So what are we talking about today? So here are just a few headlines from the last few months. Apple must allow other forms of in-app purchase. Rules judged in Epic versus Apple. EU says Apple's App Store breaks competition rules after Spotify complained. Apple offers small concession in easing App Store rules for Netflix and others. Google to open App Store payments to comply with South Korean law. So, it looks like the in-app purchase mandate or the App Store monopoly is under attack and has been under attack, especially for these past few months. So let's rewind a little bit and kind of unpack somewhat what happened. So just kind of a brief timeline of the events, and all of this is kind of stuff that happened mostly over the course of the last half year. So that's just been rapid developments. 30th of April, the EU filed its statement of objections versus Apple in the Spotify case. This is essentially their initial finding of anti-competitive behavior against Apple. On the 31st of August, South Korea passed a law mandating alternative payments to be allowed in store-based apps. Oops. On the 2nd of September, Apple settled with the Japan Free Trade Commission, specifically about reader apps, meaning apps that allow content to access to previously purchased content like books, video, audio, and music. And Apple, under this settlement, has to allow reader apps to link to external payments. On the 10th of September, the judge in the Epic trial issued an injunction against Apple's so-called anti-steering provision, which basically means not being able to tell users about alternative means of payment. On the 15th of October, Apple stated that it already complies with the South Korean law, which mandates alternative payments. On the 21st of October, Google announced that it will reduce commissions for all subscriptions to 15% as of January. Clearly a sign of some of the external pressure that's on Google as well. On the 25th of October, Apple changed their app review guidelines to allow communication of external payments outside of the app, but also limiting personal data collection. On the 4th of November, Google announced its plan for how it plans to proceed in South Korea, and essentially said, well, we'll allow external payments, but we will levy a commission. And then just yesterday, the appeals court in the Epic versus Apple case granted Apple a stay of the injunction, meaning that this injunction, which was meant to come into effect today, is now on hold until the appeals court can hear the appeal. So that's kind of stuff that happened. So what does this mean now? So what we know is changing. We know that reader apps can provide a single link to external payment and account management. And this, interestingly, applies globally. even though the settlement was only in Japan, but Apple applied this rule generally everywhere. Also, apps are allowed to communicate outside of the app about external payments. This is an interesting one because, for one thing, that's been something that most apps have been doing all along, basically kind of emailing your customers about discounts via the web and so on. And it was originally allowed, and then it was disallowed, and now it's allowed again. So there's kind of no kind of half legal, half allowed things that you have to do to basically communicate to external means of payment outside of the app. Then, kind of as outcome of the Epic versus Apple case, apps might be allowed to provide links from the app to external payments. However, this is now on hold until the appeals are heard, which could take at least months. And it's not at all clear whether the appeals court will uphold this injunction. You know, there's a few, again, like, I'm not a lawyer, but there's a few questionable takeaways here in the original injunction. For example, that the judge applied a California law to the entirety of the US. And even if this came through, it might be that it will only apply to the US to begin with. First-year commissions for subscriptions will be reduced from 30% to 15% on Google. This will be effective 1st of January. So basically, this means for commissions, there's going to be a flat 15%, and we will see if Apple will perhaps eventually follow suit. And then lastly, on Google in South Korea, apps can now offer external payments in the app with 4% less commission. So what does this mean? If you previously paid 30% commission, you will now pay 26% commission to Google on any of these external purchases made in the app. And if you're already on 15% because you're subscription-based, for example, you'll pay 11%. This one, from the announcement, it sounds like this is already in effect, but honestly, I have no clue there because I don't know anyone who's implemented this specifically for South Korea. What we know isn't changing for now, at least. For digital goods and services that are required to use in-app purchases today, in-app purchases will still be required. So, you know, this is a little bit the kind of spoiler alert answer to the question posed in the title of the talk. No, in-app purchases are very much not dead. They will still be required. And also, in-app credit card payments will still be prohibited, even if the injunction in Epic versus Apple comes into effect. There's no scenario under which in-app credit card payments are allowed for digital goods and services that are today required to use in-app purchases, with a very small exception of Google Play Store in South Korea. So what does this mean for app developers then? Firstly, in-app purchases do remain crucial. You know, they have many benefits and, well, will be required for a lot of content anyway. But also they do offer very low friction to make a purchase. You know, you basically can confirm your purchase with a thumbprint or your face. It's really low friction. Don't have to enter anything. It's, you know, the lowest friction way to make a purchase in an app by and large. And then there's also the additional point of consumer preference. So consumers trust the stores. They know that they can easily manage, you know, ask for refunds, manage subscriptions, and so on. So all of this kind of makes in-app purchases remain a very important monetization channel, even if you want to try out other things. Google's South Korea plans are relevant to most developers. I mean, you know, firstly, it's a very narrow market. It's only Google Play, only in South Korea. So unless you somehow have a very strong presence there, there's not even any reason for you to think about doing anything about this. In addition, with the added friction, so any alternative payment mechanism that you implement is going to have added friction because, you know, it's not going to be as deeply integrated as in-app purchases. That plus the fact that the commission that Google will levy essentially eats up any additional margin that you have, means that there are no quick wins, at least from a margin perspective. There might be some potential use cases, and I try to come up with a few. So, you know, for example, you can support additional means of payment. You know, for example, let's say you want to allow users to pay with cryptocurrencies or whatever. You know, that's something that you can do with this mechanism. If you have some kind of partnerships with financial institutions that allow you to get more favorable terms and therefore, you know, not have all the added margin eaten up by the Google commission, then perhaps that might be a reason. And then also there's the case of flexibility, and we'll come to that a little bit later when we talk about web subscriptions, what kind of flexibility you might want to leverage there. But again, given that it's such a narrow market, for most developers, this is simply not going to be relevant. Let's talk about web payments then, because they can make sense, but only for some scenarios. So firstly, it's important to note that it's not easy to break even with web purchases. There is a higher friction and a higher complexity. So even if and when Apple has to allow links based on Epic versus Apple, the higher friction is just very likely to erode any added margin that you have, and the higher complexity just means that you have a higher upfront investment. So to break even from a financial perspective on just a very simple kind of maths alone is very difficult. So you basically need to see if there are some specific scenarios under which these web payments make sense. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the following. So let's dive a little bit more deeply into web payments. Firstly, some caveats, because web payments are definitely not a panacea. The first one is for web payments, you will see lower conversion rates. There's just no two ways about it. If you basically compare the same cohort of users and expose them to in-app purchases, well, basically A/B tested in-app purchases versus web purchases, you would see lower conversion rates because there's higher friction. There are additional steps. You have to enter your credit card details. Even under the most kind of positive scenarios where you're using Apple Pay or something like that, it is still added friction. And there's also, in general, the consumer preference for in-app purchases. So, for example, the ease of subscription management that I mentioned earlier. So, people are just more questioning about web purchases. Will I be able to cancel this easily? Will I be able to get a refund if I want to, or if I need to? And then lastly, there's also, of course, the lack of consumer trust. So, I'm basically giving my credit card information to some random party that I know very little about. Is my credit card info going to be safe there? The second point is the implementation complexity. I already mentioned that, and I'll just want to kind of elaborate a little bit on the kinds of things that you have to do. So firstly, you have to not just implement all the purchasing, but also everything that goes around this, like subscription management, like updating payment information. People are very likely to update their credit card with the App Store or the Play Store if they get a new card, but just any kind of random app provider, much less likely. So you'll just see higher failed renewals and stuff like that for subscriptions. You also have to set up some kind of account management, meaning you have to somehow ensure that there's a link between the transaction that happens on the web and the status of the user inside the app. This means at the very least, creating some kind of link that manages to get that transaction across, or some kind of account system. That means people have to log in, people might forget a password, people might forget which social provider they logged in with. Lots of additional friction and additional points of implementation complexity. There's also the tech stack is also very vastly different, right? I mean, you basically have to have somebody who knows how to build a front-end stack, who knows how to do that in a way that's scalable, and that's typically not going to be the same person or the same team that's building your mobile apps. And you also need an abstraction layer across the web and in-app entitlements, especially if you actually want people to access their subscriptions from the web and inside the app. But even inside the app, you will now have some people who are subscribed on the store and some people who are subscribed on the web, and you basically need to be able to differentiate to tell them how they can manage their subscription, what the subscription status is, and so on. And lastly, this point is sometimes overlooked. You have tax obligations. So if you sell subscriptions yourself or sell anything yourself on the web, subscriptions or once-off purchases, you do need to calculate and remit taxes, so VAT and sales tax, for all the applicable jurisdictions that you sell in. That's, of course, a huge complexity and administrative burden. And also, there are risks in the case of non-compliance. So if you don't pay taxes, you literally might have facing severe penalties here. Of course, there are tools that can help with the calculation and so on, but you will still have a lot of this administrative complexity. There are, of course, registration thresholds. So in all jurisdictions, basically, there's a limit to when you have to start paying taxes, and if you're under that, you don't have to pay taxes. But you still need to monitor those thresholds, because your app goes viral in country X and suddenly you're over that threshold, and then you're risking non-compliance again. That said, let's talk about some of the benefits. The one thing that's kind of often overlooked, and which is a bit of a flip side of the lower conversion rate, is that you often see higher retention rates. And the story there is actually pretty clear. The higher friction on the web filters out those users who had the lowest intent to begin with, and therefore the ones that remain are the ones that are more likely to retain. So if you just look at initial conversion rates, or maybe something like ARPU, you will often see that web is performing more poorly than in-app purchases, but on an LTV perspective, the picture might be different. So you really need to kind of think about, like, what is the overall story longer term. You have more flexibility within our purchases. You're limited in terms of the price points that you can offer. You're limited in terms of the structure, in terms of how upgrades, downgrades, cross grades work, and so on. You're limited in terms of everything, basically. You're very limited in terms of what you can offer. Whereas on the web, you can basically sell everything. So customizing pricing, packaging, discounts, and so on. And I'll come to a few specific use cases later on. You also have better measurement, at least for now. Of course, we all know that with app tracking transparency, the attribution for anything that happens in-app has become more and more difficult. And on the web, you can still track a lot that you cannot track in the app anymore, because the web allows passing of URL parameters, which do enable deterministic attribution. We will see if at some point, especially Apple, starts cracking down on this as well. But for now, you definitely have better measurement on the web than you have in-app. And I'm also not a user acquisition expert, so my depth of knowledge here is always somewhat limited. You also do own the customer relationship. Of course, there's particularly a problem on the Apple App Store, where you cannot even refund or cancel subscriptions. You basically have no direct relationship with your customers other than what you can establish inside the app. And that's of course not true on the web. You can do everything that you want. And lastly, there is the very slim possibility of improved margins. I mean, already mentioned earlier that it's very likely that however you do it, any improved like the added margin, the 30% versus, let's say, 3% for Stripe, gets eaten up by all the added friction and so on. However, there are some products that do have real world marginal costs, where every additional customer that you sell to, actually you incur some marginal cost. And in those cases, it might be that the business model just isn't viable. If you kind of have a 30% commission going to Apple or Google. And so in those cases, it can make sense. But for those of us who have kind of purely digital content with no marginal cost or very low marginal cost, this is very unlikely to be true. So let's talk then about some use cases where web payments can still have benefits under all of these scenarios. So firstly, monetizing customers with the highest intent and highest willingness to pay. I already mentioned earlier that the added friction for web purchases is in any case filtering out those with lower willingness to pay. So if you can somehow target web purchases at those users and those customers who do have the highest intent and highest willingness to pay, then you're less likely to see big impacts from that. And also there, of course, then you benefit tremendously from the added margin. Web payments also allow for rapid experimentation and conversion rate optimization. So in general, the web technology is just a bit more malleable and more easily, more quickly shipped, more quickly experimented with, more quickly changed than apps. In general, if you want to experiment with your in-app paywall, you'll have to ship a new version of the app, implement some kind of system to toggle on that experiment remotely, see what it does, turn it off again. On the web, you can simply ship a new version as often and as frequently as you want. Of course, there are ways to make this happen in the app as well, with over-the-air updates or kind of components of the app that are hosted on a server somewhere. But that's all added complexity. That's all stuff that you need to build first. Whereas on the web, that's just built in. That's just kind of how it works. That's just how web technology works. So, there is a case to be made here to say, hey, I'm going to run some very quick testing on the web, and then I will transport those learnings back into the app. That is somewhat limited, of course, because as I mentioned earlier, the conversion behavior will be slightly different. And particularly for those customers who have lower intent, you're just kind of filtering them out on the web because of the friction. So your persona might be slightly different, but you can still try and see kind of what is the way to take those learnings and apply them to your mobile app. Bundling and personalization, and especially things that happen cross app. So on the web, as I mentioned, kind of in terms of packaging and bundling and so on, you're very much unlimited in terms of your possibilities. So, for example, if you want to sell a bundle of subscriptions to multiple apps, that's not something that you can do on the store unless you basically build some kind of complicated backend that allows honoring the subscription status in one app, also in the other one. On the web, it's not a problem at all. You can basically sell everything and anything that you want. On the personalization side, you can personalize prices, you can personalize discount, you can basically show everyone their own version of the product. And again, that's not something that's possible on the stores, where you just have the SKUs that you have set up and kind of nothing in between. You can set up things like affiliate and referral programs where, for example, somebody resells your refers you a customer and then gets some kind of kickback. Again, on the stores, there's at least no native way to make that happen. So you'd have to basically do kind of a very, very complex workaround to even start tracking that. And even then it wouldn't be perfect, most likely because of things like app tracking transparency. In general, separating the buyer and the customer, and in particular bulk purchasing. So for example, I always give an example here of, let's say you have a mental health app and some kind of employer wants to offer your app as a perk to all their employees. Under the store, there's within our purchases, there's really no way to make that happen. The closest that you would get is every employee buys their own subscription and then expenses that and gets reimbursed by the employer. On the web, you can simply have the employer buy a bulk license for like 100 seats and then use that for all the individual end users. And of course, there are other use cases like this as well. Anything where the buyer and the customer isn't the same person, the web purchases are just kind of the way to go. Lifecycle discounts or win-back CRM campaigns. So, this is kind of the typical case of sending you an email with, hey, here's 20% off, with the knowledge of 30% would be the commission for Apple or Google in any case. And if I offer 20% discount, I actually still make more money in the end. This can be interesting. However, you should really be thinking about this not just from a one campaign at a time or one message at a time, but really think about the holistic CRM strategy and where does it make sense to offer discounts? Does it make sense to offer discounts in the app first, via email first? What is your overall the overall life cycle of the customer? What are segments that are interesting? However, there is a real possibility here to basically generate some somewhat free wins. Then there's a couple of points about user acquisition. So of course, web to app paid user acquisition is something that has been growing over the past few months, especially with iOS 14.5 and app tracking transparency, because you do have that better attribution on the web. So basically, the idea here is that instead of linking people from an ad to the store, you link them to a web landing page where they can actually sign up and then make a purchase, start a subscription or buy some gems or whatever. And only then after that do you link them to the app. I mean, this flow is of course overall quite complicated, because you basically have to find a way to create the user account from the web and then have them download the app, make sure that they get logged into the right account and so on. But it is something that people have been experimenting with, particularly for some channels that don't even have an app install product, for example, Pinterest, Outbrain, and Taboola. And I'm not a user acquisition expert, so again, my depth here is definitely somewhat limited. So let's talk about some practical considerations then for how to make web payments work. Firstly, you should really try and limit your implementation to narrowly defined use cases. What this should have made clear is that this is a complex topic and one that can grow in complexity the more you try to achieve with this. So instead of saying what is the ideal universally applicable web transaction infrastructure, web purchase infrastructure, try to really think about the list of use cases that I shared and think about which ones are the ones that apply to me, or maybe there's other use cases that I haven't mentioned, but really try to define that well. Why do we believe that web purchaser will be working for us under which conditions, and then try to create a solution that fits that use case. Definitely do consider supporting things like Apple Pay, Google Pay, PayPal to increase conversion rates. Everything that you can do, these work in two ways. Firstly, they reduce friction because people don't have to enter their credit card details. They might not have their credit card handy when they want to purchase. So all of these, have the user's credit card information stored already. So that's definitely a lot less friction. But they also increase trust, because there's a trusted provider there that they know that they also believe that they can basically get some kind of recourse from if things don't really go their way. Then for the tax point, consider using a merchant of record to not have to calculate and remit local taxes. So the merchant of record is basically the same model that Apple and Google use for in-app purchases, where a merchant of record is a reseller of your digital products. So they essentially act as the seller and sell them in the different jurisdictions that they're active in and remit taxes, and then pay you as the app publisher a wholesale price, essentially. Of course, they need to get reimbursed for that, so there's a little bit of reduced margin there, but a lot reduced complexity as well. So examples here would be companies like FastSpring or Paddle. And then, of course, lastly, I would be remiss to not also mention RevenueCat. So if you are offering cross-platform subscriptions, then do consider a solution like RevenueCat that basically provides an abstraction layer over the different platforms. For example, how does a subscription look like in Stripe and what is its life cycle versus how does it look on Apple versus how does it look on Google, and having kind of one abstraction layer over those, reduces the implementation cost and implementation complexity here. This brings me to the end of the section about web purchases, and I just kind of have one more slide about the future outlook. So the timeline started with the EU Spotify case, and the EU is most likely, is definitely kind of a wild card still in this whole story. So both the Spotify case and further EU regulation may further threaten the store monopoly or monopolies or duopoly or whatever you want to call it. So firstly, the EU is certainly watching Epic versus Apple to see if what's happening there remedies any of their concerns in the Spotify case. Of course, Spotify is specifically about music, about Apple Music versus Spotify. But the arguments that the EU Commission has been making in the case definitely do apply outside of the music realm. Secondly, there's draft regulation, the EU Digital Markets Act, which this draft was published in December and will still probably look different when it's actually enacted. But the EU basically plans to require platforms like Apple/iOS to allow alternative app stores. So, a gatekeeper shall allow the installation and effective use of third-party software applications or software application stores. Of course, the question here does remain, who might launch a feasible alternative store with sufficient adoption? This is definitely outside of the scope of this presentation today, but you can spend definitely hours musing over the question of whether there will be any stores outside, especially like outside of kind of limited scenarios, like for example, game streaming might be one where it makes sense that that alternative stores actually have some penetration. But for those of us who are just kind of in the general space of apps, whether there's going to be any alternative app store that ever has any sufficient adoption and any sufficient conversion remains to be seen, and is kind of, at the very least, doubtful at this point in time. That brings me to the end of my talk. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'm definitely happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Jens. Yeah, you think I would learn by now, but there you go. So, okay, I don't know. We've kind of got your tiny head in the corner, Jens. I don't know if it's worth.
Yes.
Can you go in and out of the stream?
Yes, let me. In theory, yes. Let me see how I can do that.
Hopefully, we won't lose you because we do have a few questions. No. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, we've had a few already, which we'll cover. Perfect. Okay, so let's just kick off. So it's a very interesting presentation. One question on the third-party payment in South Korea. This is from Joe. You mentioned Google's still taking commission apparently, but it's lower. How would effectively they do that if it's for a third party? I mean, it'd have to be some sort of integration, right? So.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a very interesting point, and it's one that we don't know exactly about the enforcement there, but this is not something that is kind of unheard of. So one very interesting kind of aspect here is actually if you look at Epic. So one of the things that Epic does, of course, is publish its Unreal Engine, and its Unreal Engine is actually based on a commission for revenue model, but the Unreal Engine doesn't actually collect that revenue. So how does this work? Well, a developer who uses the Unreal Engine basically has to open their books to Epic and tell them, here, look, this is how much money I made. So I don't know yet exactly how this will be enforced by Google in South Korea, but there's definitely precedence about having this not be basically technically enforced by some kind of integration, but rather just by additional administration and bureaucracy, and developers having to tell Google, hey, this is how much money we made from alternative payments. And if Google then doesn't believe it, you basically have to kind of prove and show records and so on. So I think that's kind of the breadth of the possibilities there. This, by the way, is also a question that will remain open, even if Apple is eventually forced in the Epic versus Apple case to open up linking to web payments. They could still then say, hey, you can do that, but we will still collect some commission. And again, they probably wouldn't be able to collect that data automatically, but they would be well within their rights. And interestingly, that's something that the judge in the case even explicitly stated.
Got it. And you talked about some of the downsides of web payments, in terms of having to log in and that kind of thing. So David Curry's asking, could we expect to see some kind of unified wrapper or overlay type of system, a bit like with e-commerce, where you go to the Shopify store and start entering your email and they've already got your details? I think, yeah, Stripe's very similar. It's kind of preloaded, and I buy something off one app, and or is that something RevenueCat's working on? Maybe your level of the layer.
Yeah, this is also a fantastic question. So, I mean, definitely we have been thinking about this as well. Is there something that we can do there? And just on the checkout side, Stripe is working on something like this as well, where you'll basically have some of that problem solved. In general, there will always be some added friction, regardless of how you do it. So, for example, I mean, I can tell you one thing that we've been working on at RevenueCat is basically trying to see, is there a way that we can reduce the friction of having to create an account in two places, by just kind of passing data to the app itself via a deep link. And then because we have the RevenueCat SDK in the app, that the SDK could react to the deep link and basically honor the externally made transaction. However, there's always edge cases there. You know, the user has uninstalled the app, something else happens, something breaks. There's always edge cases there. So you will have to basically provide fallbacks for these edge cases, because otherwise people will see that their money is gone and they didn't get what they expected from the money. They made the transaction, but the app didn't honor it for some reason. So you'll have to have some kind of fallback mechanisms for these edge cases in any case. So yeah, like, you know, kind of the two answers there are, this is going to be complicated no matter what, but yes, we are working on some solutions there with RevenueCat, and certainly other providers in the space are also working on it. So over time, the friction might be reduced, but it's still not going to be as easy and as frictionless as an in-app purchase is.
Got it. And on that point, is this going to push? You mentioned some of the difficulties of testing anything with in-app payments. Is this going to push Apple and Google to create better A/B testing environments, a bit like they have just done with the App Store, or are they going to be pretty slow off the mark?
I think this is a very good question. I think in general, Google, as kind of often, is a little bit more advanced in that respect. I think for Apple, it's very unlikely that we'll see something there quickly. And of course, this is only my kind of guesstimate. I think for one thing, Apple simply just doesn't seem to believe in A/B testing, something like pricing. So, you know, with all of the structures that are in place with subscription groups and so on, I don't know that that they will be offering that much more there. Similarly, you know, there's no programmatic creation of SKUs except for like very limited cases. So, you know, all of it just points in the direction that if something is coming there, then it'll be very, very slow.
And John Groves, who is at Sonic Tonic, he's asking, what about coupon codes? Is that one sort of workaround, selling a coupon code for the app?
Yeah, sure. You can, well, you can do that. However, this is limited in its applicability as well. So if you look at the app review guidelines for Apple, they basically say you cannot unlock content using any other mechanism other than in-app purchase. And you know, like a kind of coupon code in and of itself certainly wouldn't work under those rules. So you'll have to see what exactly are you doing, what exactly are you trying to achieve, and is there a way to do that within the realms of what's possible with the app review guidelines. But you know, just simply saying, hey, you know, I'm not selling you the content on the web, I'm selling you a coupon, and then you enter that in the app, isn't going to be possible because of the guidelines.
Great. And I think this has to be the final question. Gwilym, who's the CEO of Heavy, is asking, hi Jens, nice presentation. You mentioned Google lowered its subscription commission to 15% starting January the 1st. However, back in July the 1st, they already lowered their commission to 15% for the first million in revenue. Bit confused there. Can you clarify what's changed?
Yes. So hi, GM. We actually used to work together at 8fit, so we know each other personally. So basically, if you're making less than $1 million, nothing is changing. This is just for those who are making more than $1 million. Now, also the first, you know, the first year is 15%. So this basically just means, regardless of how much you are making, it's 15% across the board, which kind of just simplifies things on Google's end, on the kind of calculation and on the customer side as well. So just makes everything kind of easier and more streamlined.
Great. Well, good to have the 8fit Mafia here. I don't know if Thomas Petit is also in the house. Probably he'll catch up with this at some point. Yeah, I know he's very interested in this space as well. But yeah, great. Well, we're out of time, Jens, and glad you're able to do this session online. We've got a great recording of it now, so we'll be able to spread it far and wide. And yeah, I hope your son's feeling better after the last week. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Great.